Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today I want to talk about the subject of NAS projects on Kickstarter. I think a number of us would agree that this opening ground between turnkey NAS and open source DIY systems, this void that's in the middle is getting bigger and bigger and being filled a lot of the time by kind of turnkey solutions that run on open source software or smaller players, and the big names in the world of network attached storage and servers in general starting to populate that field. And I think a big reason for this is crowdfunding websites, your Kickstarters, your Indiegogos and stuff like that. And we don't have to look very far to see that this growing subject of either NAS as a software platform and GUI and just general operating system, or as a complete package, is getting more diverse than it's ever been. For example, we talked about it kind of vaguely, and we do kind of have a video planned for this on the subject of Linus Tech Tips, LTT investing, quite a substantial, I think it's $250,000 on a brand new, supposedly very easy to use NAS OS there, something we might be talking about in another video soon as frankly more information becomes available about it. And I think obviously one of the biggest catalysts for this video is something I talked about a while ago, the Storaxa NAS, something I've committed to make a video on every single month until we've got one here in the studio arriving. However, above and beyond that, the more I've been kind of looking into this subject of Kickstarter and NAS crowdfunding projects, big and small, and indeed this growing, void between DIY and turnkey complete solutions there, it's becoming more and more apparent that the history of NAS on Kickstarter is a great deal more diverse than a number of us might have thought. And in today's video, I have got all manner of solutions, look at the bottom of the screen there, to go through today. These are going to include Kickstarters that were successful, Kickstarters that crossed the line and then may or may not have been successful, and of course we will be talking about some of the ones that didn't make it for good or for bad reasons all the way through. But I think it's worth highlighting straight away to the few disclaimers. Number one, the word NAS is a pretty broad term for the sake of this video. And just looking at my notes, we are looking at anything really that came under the heading of a private server, a private cloud. I hate seagulls. I hope you remember what I said in the comments there, Tom. Private cloud, a backup target device, NAS software, or any kind of home lab device. So there's going to be the odd bit of Raspberry Pi in here. We're not going to include things like the Eon, by the way, which was a Kickstarter program, but that was more of a casing for a Raspberry Pi 4. So we're really going for either NAS software, network software, or complete server devices, and then we'll break down into each of those projects for good and for bad. But as mentioned, a lot of this comes down to the sheer scale of projects on there. It's actually a lot harder than you think to identify because of the way Kickstarter's searching system works. So for example, we're looking at here just the word server, and we have a lot of irrelevancy there. Even if we were to switch that to technology, we still don't get a huge degree of narrowing it down. We see the odd result there, some of which we're going to talk about later on, but it's still a little bit messy. Even if you look for the term NAS in of itself, that becomes too concise there. So again, this is taking a little while to put this all together. I'm going to see if it's worth making an article on this. If it is, it'll be linked in the description below. But just to give you an example of some of the crossover, the first solution we will talk about here is the Spreedbox or Spreadbox. Again, I didn't really work out the pronunciation there. This was a campaign that crossed the line. It only crossed it by about €5,000 there, and this was a kind of conference center device there. A lot of these videos, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to play due to YouTube copyright and stuff like that, and again, I'm going to have to make sure that things are muted there as well. But it did really, really well. It was reviewed in a number of different places there, and indeed the product went on to, land quite successfully there. I would say one of the things you're going to see, there you are, Tom, you're replying to my comment from earlier, one of the things you may kind of see as a consistent thread throughout a lot of these campaigns, good and for bad, is going to be that presentation. I know it seems incredibly obvious, but a lot of it is the structure and how much of it is template and how much it is unique. And one of the things you will see in the more successful campaigns, bar one, that I will be talking about in a lot more detail in another video but alluding to later, is the sheer level of detail that is given early doors. I know that doesn't necessarily mean success, but in the case of the Spreedbox, they really did go above and beyond there with that timeline there, identifying all of the individual backers, not backers, the original creators, I should say, sharing to a lot of those multimedia platforms. And ultimately, even though it was a relatively modest sum and it was predominantly just to get the project off the ground, they did stay on top of those updates, they stayed on top of those comments, and they consistently, you know, updated even beyond the Kickstarter initial campaign drawing to a conclusion, leading to, in the end, just ultimately not only their product being successful, but leading to further generations of it. And again, with awards all the way through, it's not the cheapest device, but I think they were very clear about what they wanted to do with this device as a conference system, as a local kind of localized storage for all of those recordings, rather than being overly reliant on cloud and remote bandwidth there. Ultimately, that is an example to me of a successful Kickstarter there. Obviously, it's all about when it crosses the line at the end, but overall, I would say, given the relative small numbers, and by that I do, you know, let's call it what it is, 28,000 euros is not a small sum. When you look at the number of backers versus it, this could also be considered a project that is designed to promote a brand long-term as well, something we talked about previously with that Storaxa there. But let's move on to another project. Of course, we already talked about this about a week and a half ago, the ZimaBoard. This one left an incredibly positive impression on me here. I reviewed it on the channel ourselves. We were looking at the device and it kind of blew me away in terms of the production quality there. And this, when I heard about this device, it was long after the Kickstarter had concluded there. So a lot of this I'm obviously viewing in hindsight there. But even looking at those updates, it was a very positive kind of outlook all the way through. A lot of those kind of extra goals going through, and ultimately it was quite realistic about what it was trying to achieve, and indeed the kind of home lab audience it was targeted towards. I'm not quite sure where the additional backing was coming from there, because they've definitely gone from strength to strength. And from what I understand, speaking to them after the review of the previous product they fired over to me, that they are working on a follow-up to this device. Whether that is just going to be another configuration of the hardware, who knows? But overall, this looked, you know, it had all the hallmarks of a good campaign, and ultimately it's why, when we were referring to that Storaxa Kickstarter before, why a lot of people are still very confident about that, and I can totally see why. Because when you look at this, this is not dissimilar numbers. Yes, it's 2.5 million Hong Kong dollar, which is again about 260,000 pounds. But still, they were very realistic about the capabilities of the device, and even in their initial presentation, revealed a lot of those connections and presentations about performance that is often missing from a lot of these. Obviously, if you're crowdfunding, it means you want the bunts to develop the product, so a lot of the time that product simply cannot exist, but still nonetheless, they seem to be a lot more OTT when it came to information early doors, which is always a promising sign overall. Obviously, you know, that's straight the way through, but it was little things, even, again, hindsight, so we are looking at this from the past. It was stuff like the main core updates not being locked behind backer only visibility there. And in those 1,000 comments, obviously they're not all going to be positive. It's a comment section, but still nonetheless, it was just generally a well-presented experience. I still hate seagulls. And overall, when it comes to the Kickstarters I've spoken about, this ZimaBoard is probably going to be one of those Kickstarters I will happily point at as a very well-run campaign in terms of NAS and private server ownership. Next up, this is the first one of our Raspberry Pi type solutions here, and it's one that really bowled me over once again. Because of the design, it's one of those quirky things that is just so Kickstarter and so Indiegogo. This is a Docker container literally in a miniature container. And again, it was another one of those campaigns where they went really OTT in a lot of the presentation and the information. It's one that has since ended. I believe, when did it end? On June 2016. And it was a sort of, but not completely, a one and done. When we go through, again, very responsive to those individual updates. Again, with not all of them, I will add, being accessible and visible to everyone, which really surprised me a little bit, because that's generally one of the things that people get quite abrasive about when it comes to a lot of campaigns. But overall, It seems like when they committed to this project, the band largely either disbanded into smaller groups or towards other endeavours, but they did ship out the rewards, they did ship out the solutions. A few people did say they didn't receive them, but they still continued to respond upwards of 11 months later. Again, since then, of course, it kind of drew to a halt, and it was hardware at the company, and they got all the way down to the final units they had left over in the little tiny containers. And again, that was 2016. We've not really heard much since, at least on this product. But again, members of their original hardware, they did seem to go on a couple of them to other things there. But this is something I would call a successful one and done campaign, although it's a lot more, miniaturized with that Raspberry Pi design there, and it is the desktop container with it included as well, because you can see there from the side there. But overall, a nice successful campaign, and one that I looked on quite fondly, and one that I kind of wish I could have got behind when it was rolling around. And another campaign here based on Raspberry Pi architecture that I kind of wish I'd known at the time, and this one is from last year, which really surprised me. It didn't appear on my radar, at least a little bit there in the comments, was the PiBox, a little 2-bay SSD or 5-bay system, and ultimately it really landed well. You can see there right going down by the campaign there with well over $200,000, and again that's dollars US, raised there all the way through. And again, it was delayed, I will say. There was the usual delays, but at the same time they did provide all of that useful information about the project. They did detail a lot of the expectations, a lot of the hurdles as well, and if we go into the updates there, they were forthcoming with those. It wasn't a perfectly ran campaign, there were the inevitable delays as well, but overall this seemed to be another one of those ones where a lot of people towards the end of the project got a little bit antsy about when it was going to arrive, but when it did deliver, it was seemingly positive all the way around. And this went on, of course, after they were all shipped out, to them producing this long term, again with the 2-bay and that 5-bay running. So this is another example of a Kickstarter campaign that went on to kind of graduate into something a lot more. One of these I might even consider getting for a video here on the channel, because I'm actually kind of fascinated by it. There's a lot of these Raspberry Pi Kickstarter solutions when they were rolling out that seem to be the same thing over and over, but just a few bubbling to the surface there. And that brings back to when we're looking at list of servers, where some of these Raspberry Pi solutions seemingly were just people trying to make a quick buck, when you've got ones like these where a lot of design work really went into those chassis as well. And yes, you're still overly reliant on open source, but some of these one board single servers really, appealing in the extreme when you're looking at the expense of a lot of the combined OS turnkey solutions out there to really make a hell of a saving. You look at the campaign costings there, and it's, surprisingly affordable. Some of the kind of packages you would get with some of these and the price point you were paying there. Overall, I really love this. But I think, unfortunately, that's enough positivity. I think we're going to have to start looking at some of the projects that either didn't cross the line or ones that did and still didn't really make much of a noise. Now, solutions like the Cloudster have to be looked at in a certain point of view, because you have to factor in that we are still talking about something from 2012. And nevertheless, it was 2012 when Cloudster was trying to reveal its 1 TB secure cloud backup NAS, and it still only received £722 backing out of a £16,000 goal. Now, why was that? We could look at a few things there. One, their FAQ was surprisingly well detailed there. They kind of went through a lot of the bits and bobs, but not really anything above and beyond standard expectations of a retail kit. The original comments there, I think a lot of people's slight apprehension about this solution was, even in 2012, it wasn't really cutting edge at that point. And if you look at the actual campaign tiers here, start at the usual 5, then leaping straight up to a 1 TB model for 324 and arriving with a subscription service attached. I think a lot of users, even at that point, I think that was where the idea of synchronized cloud and having cloud gateway, so it wasn't about cloud versus NAS, but it was actually about harnessing both in a hybrid setup, wasn't really as commercially polished as it's become these days. And I think that was probably one of the hurdles that it had to deal with early doors. Now, when the campaign was running, I will say it did see quite a lot of coverage on, quite high-profile news websites there, and it was touched on a number of places. And indeed, although it did not go on to fulfilling its campaign, and therefore people didn't lose any money on this, it did look like the people that were involved in it did go on to other things. Unfortunately, when it comes to the Cloudster moniker, the best I could find is a Brazilian organisation here related to cloud. It was established at approximately the same time, but I'm not 100% certain that this is still the same operation. And again, I wish I could play some of these videos for you here. Ultimately, between all of them, you can see more and more that the original sites have no longer existed here, so it makes it very hard to chase up this campaign. And all we've really got is this brief snapshot of the layout of the campaign and what it was trying to achieve. But even when we look at the risks, all it came down to was Kickstarter's own liability risks and not really anything more. And I think, once again, I hate to use hindsight there, but even this 2012 campaign, people were already quite savvy about this kind of technology, and it just wasn't presenting the right level of engagement and indeed information, despite it appearing on multiple websites online, that would have made it any kind of successful crowdfunding position there. However, not all unsuccessful Kickstarter campaigns, NAS or otherwise, are necessarily the end, and probably one of the best examples of an unsuccessful Kickstarter campaign that still managed to do something in spite of that is the Helios4. This is a NAS that I heard about for the better part of a year and a half after the campaign, and that's because despite the fact that their goal of £90,000 wasn't hit, only achieving 60,000 across 337 backers, and the funding was unsuccessful, ergo they didn't receive a penny of it because they weren't able to hit that target marker within their deadline, it actually went on to become a real product. The Helios4 their campaign was very, very detailed. It had a relentless social media campaign as well, hence how it appeared on my radar. I continue to hate seagulls, and they weren't, they were pretty forthcoming with a lot of their information. They had a very detailed FAQ about some of the parts and components they were going to use. They weren't using any of that behind backer only engagement there, even in the comments section, although there's only 176, because compared with things like that Storaxa that we talked about, is still a little bit more niche. They did seem to be very engaging with their audience, and if anything, to saying more in their responsive than the original questions. They're always a good sign. Now, even though it was unsuccessful, and if you look at some of the pricing of their solutions in the initial bids, they seem to be very modest in a lot of the early bird stuff and pre-purpose kit. It went on afterwards to kind of take shape and change into the COBOL. Now, the COBOL team has since ceased production and investment in development of the Helios4, but we can still access the store there and see that original 5-bay solution there ended up rolling out just shy of $300 there, and we saw several units out there in the wild, for review, people utilizing it, making comparisons against the likes of WD and even Synology to a degree there. And remember, we are talking about a Kickstarter that started in 2017. This isn't like a 2010, 2011 campaign. We're not talking about something where the NAS industry wasn't that established. 2017, the big players had pretty much cut up their share of the market at that point. And again, it's no longer supported, so if you did have one, people are just slowly but surely trying to flog them off, and you can still find them online. I think I want one for the back of this studio, to be perfectly honest with you, but that is an example for me of that there is hope even in a campaign that doesn't reach and cross the finish line, because some ideas can still be funded another way, and clearly the Helios4 is a great example of that. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have Kickstarters like this one, the Terminator-NAS all-in-one box. Had a goal of £50,000 and raised £2. Now, why is that? Why was this so different to any of the other solutions we looked at so far? And why did this get overlooked to such a high degree? And a lot of that comes down to that presentation, because I've read through this twice, and it's still not abundantly clear what exactly this project is offering. Whether it is a hardware solution, whether it is a software solution, whether it is a managed plugin, whether it is them providing a ready-to-go kit or remote access setup, there seems to be a lot of inconsistencies throughout that whole campaign. And there's a lot of buzzwords, but not really any kind of main level understanding of what the product is, mainly about an idea of what it's hoping to provide generally across the industry, and less so much about the project itself. And then when you go to the project goals there, what you get, you suddenly go from a pledge of £50 for a memory stick. But again, it doesn't really go into a tremendous amount of detail what you are getting there all the way through. And even the hardware design there, we're seeing throughout the updates, they did show a little bit of work. One of them is a copy of Tekken, for example, which I believe was to do with the system running emulation. But even when they're talking about samples, is this hardware, is this software samples? Or even if you dig down into it, there isn't a huge amount of information. And when you look down into an update from 2019 on this project, what you're seeing is a fairly generic box, some of which you can get some of these mini ITXs over on Ali, you know, for anywhere from 40 to 60 to maybe 70 Nika. So it's another one of those campaigns that kind of fell over, I would say, due to that presentation element, for good or for bad. Next up, the Nanohive. Now, this is one, again, I remember vaguely in the past someone raising with me, but this goes all the way back to 2014, so that was kind of, you know, pre-YouTube career, so I've got very little to highlight personally on this one, at least as far as the channel is concerned. But this was another one of the examples of trying to make private cloud ownership and private data ownership cloud accessible, more user-friendly to a lot of users out there. Unfortunately, again, it fell over, I would argue, not so much this time down to the presentation, but the era it was entering into, 2014 again. The reason being, at that point, private cloud ownership, I'd say 2013-14 was the zenith as far as consumer software and consumer hardware is concerned. If you go back to my WD video recently, that was kind of when the kind of affordable home ownership of data and remote access, WD had cleaned it up really at that point with the My Personal Cloud and the early My Cloud systems there, for good or for bad. This being just a plug point with USB port and an Ethernet connection there, it was effectively promising that it would give you the ability to attach your localized storage on a USB drive and allow it to be accessed via cloud connected domain at the nanohive.com server. But as you can see, actually we'll remove that prefix there. It didn't really, you know, obviously it hasn't continued there, and the funding there got very close actually to the target goal, but still didn't cross the line, and it was the creators themselves that ceased the campaign. Again, I'd have to go into the timeline to find out more about that, but it did see a reasonable amount of backing. It certainly saw engagement in the comment section there, for good or for bad, but I think a lot of it is a lot of people saying solutions like this continue to exist, and unfortunately became something of a shout chamber in there, which is a real shame, because I think this was a project that, for its ease and simplicity, could have been something. But I think this is another arguable line there between a secure setup solution that is frankly going to have to be set on defaults, and therefore you're going to be relying on a device to do all that for you, so you don't have to think about security, and those end up being the most worrisome secure devices, because then they're all set up to a default or not set up securely. And this seems, for its low-level hardware, to be something that, unless they'd really spent the extra money on some of that pen testing and more, could have been problematic. Overall, looking at it, and we'll ignore all those comments there because they get really sweary up to a point. They did try. I don't think this was a project that was scamming. I think this was a device that did seemingly have some, you know, dedicated people behind it, but it wasn't probably managed as well as it could have been in terms of its presentation, although it did see kind of highlights on different websites in terms of promotion. The campaign, the more you dig into it, when you go to some of the open tech forums, or the Element 14, when they started talking about it on there, they're immediately kind of torn apart by the solution, its security, its similarity to existing kind of mobile routers in the market, and ultimately being in 2014 when things kind of got really consumer focused. Maybe if it arrived a year or two sooner, it may have done better. Now, this is one that I've spent quite a lot of time reading because I'm still trying to figure out precisely what went wrong. Now, this is January 2020, and it is effectively a miniature mobile cluster server with individual nodes built into a device that seemed like it was going to be about this big. Again, with the pledge total there, aiming for £40,000, only reaching 3,000. It is a very well presented campaign with next to no engagement. I can see even the backers themselves, hardly anyone commented upon or engaged in either direction beyond the original campaign. And whether this was, you know, maybe an AliExpress solution that someone was trying to tart up, I don't know. But I couldn't really find a solution like this elsewhere presented in the way this is being presented. Again, I should have mentioned earlier on, all of these campaigns are going to be linked in the description, and maybe that article if I have time to put it together. But as far, I know there's a lot of the standard kind of imagery fare there, but it was actually quite a detailed presentation there. They did talk about a lot of some of the hurdles they would be going through, more in the actual presentation of the campaign rather than in the individual risks area. They even produced a timeline there. They produced a lot of the 3D CAD graphics. And ultimately, even with the pricing, although obviously you're looking at Hong Kong dollars, and normally it's, you know, that would come down to about, you know, 400 odd pounds. It still seemed to be quite a well-presented campaign that seemingly went nowhere. And maybe it was that it was, you know, not really something that was going to get off the ground anyway, or they just looked at the money they weren't raising and went, it's not worth our time. But still, this is one of those campaigns that I look on and think this could have probably been something, or actually became something else. Because it's got the usual kind of promo actor type stuff there, whether that's the original people or not. But this is just another one of those campaigns that never made it. But even going through the history there, I haven't really any understanding of why it didn't complete it. It was even live for the better part of a month and a half, as you can see there. But let's move on. Another example of a wrong place, wrong time Kickstarter server solution would be the Doodah. What an odd name. Even the subtitle, keeping the kids quiet, hopefully since 2016. I mean, this was slightly comedic, this campaign, which can always be something of a knife edge when it comes to technology campaigns and the solution you're providing. Again, 70,000 goal, only hit $1.5 grand there, and there was very little engagement. And if I had to summarise the big issue with this one in this update in 2017 campaign, it would be this comment here. I'd hate to burst your bubble, but I believe that a similar device has already hit the market. And they were talking about the Hutu. And again, the Hutu, again, a lot of that was an Indiegogo and stuff like that with their following campaigns. But notwithstanding the Hutu mini server box portable, the issue was that in that point at 2017, there were loads of things like this. And even when you look at the imagery there that was put together for the campaign, the casing there, they were talking about some of the insides. This is already in a busy marketplace at that point. And although there were some unique things from a design stance point, from a technology stance point, and the fact that you'd have to kind of start developing a lot of the OS capabilities to be a little bit more proprietary to this platform, that was where I think this was always going to fall down in terms of what it was capable of and how it could deliver on it. And it didn't seem to be very long before the creators were kind of made aware of that, if we look at the updates there with regards to, and again, going backer only, sad days. As you can see, even the sad days, thanks for your support, that shouldn't be behind a backers only update. They tried, fair play to them, but overall, as far as the campaign there, I think presentation and timing was what really took this one down overall. Talking of timing, here's another solution. I think had it arrived maybe 2 years earlier, and I know that's after the 2000, mid 2010s boom, I'd say this was actually quite a nice little idea. $99 personal cloud and server. So already they're kind of aware of the presentation point they're going to have to go for a solution. Again, a 16,000 goal and only raising 9, so no one lost money on it. But even with the updates, they were there was just a one update there in the comments. There was engagement and there were questions. But again, it became very apparent very early in the presentation that they were going to go for a relaunch and reattempt it because they felt like it wasn't done as well as it could have been in terms of the overall presentation, and they thought they'd, not done it well enough, which is a shame because they actually go into quite a lot of detailed design stance there all the way through, talking a lot more about the software and showing off some of that GUI, talking about a lot of the solution, and even naming a lot of their team there that you could look up afterwards. So this wasn't a campaign that didn't already have a reasonable amount of research put into it, and it did appear on a few different websites as well, IssueWire as well, detailing it. But overall, I think its big problem there was, again, a question of timing when it came out, and just oversaturation at that point of mini little cloud boxes. Remember, this is March 2020, so we can't even strictly say this was a pandemic problem at that, because that was the last update there. And although the pandemic had already sort of really made its social and economic mark by March in a lot of the world, I can't really say that that was the reason this didn't do well. Maybe it did get relisted. You can go to the Anakyn Labs page there and have a look at their existing projects, and if you go to their own website, as you can see, when we open it up, not really getting anywhere with this at that time, but still nonetheless it did still make news and it made noise overall. So although it's one of those solutions that didn't make it, the company seemingly still at least exists in this file, but whether they're doing anything beyond this or they gave up at this hurdle, we'll have to wait and see. Which leads us to the final example of an unsuccessful campaign today, and this comes under the heading of passion project, because when it comes to a lot of Kickstarters, there's always going to be the ones that are people trying to make a name for themselves or their business. There'll be ones where it's someone has a vision of something they want to build from, but sometimes it is just a passion project, and moxibox feels like a passion project. Again, a goal of just £2,814, only achieving 997 there across the 30 backers. This felt like a one-man project, this gentleman here, Lee Allen, and you go through it and he's really poured himself into this project, appearing on other areas of just basically, he's clearly got experience in the industry and what he's doing, and has a tremendous enthusiasm in what he's doing and his updates. But unfortunately, even when you look at it being 2014, where this kind of falls down is the presentation once again. And it's that idea that that personal passion project, when you're talking about a home lab system, it didn't really come across probably as articulately as he would have liked. And I think regardless of the fact it does sound like a very good solution, it also just sounds like a NAS, but you're going to have to learn a new OS. And I think more time should have been spent presenting the software capabilities more than the hardware capabilities in that description. It is detailed, and it even goes into an extensive amount of information about the file system in the background, something I think a lot of the cloud systems, particularly DIY NAS systems, didn't really go into enough detail about, but it does look like this is something he wasn't able to fully realize there when we go through all of the different areas of, and again, apart from, which is clearly not this, or at least I assume it's not for 2002, over on the Sydney Morning Herald. But as far as a lot of these projects go, this is one I think that's probably the saddest one, because it's when it's a personal project and it's something that someone's trying to develop, probably either on their own or a small team. These are the ones where unfortunately earnestness doesn't carry quite enough weight on a lot of projects to, get people to put their hand in their pockets. And despite it being a relatively modest sum, because we are still talking about a software platform and its capabilities towards different hardware, I think Lee Allen here and the moxibox didn't quite get his chance to realise due to presentation more so than anything else. And there you have it. Those are 12 different Kickstarters over the last decade or so for different NAS solutions out there and server ones. But before you go, I just want to talk about one more project, one I'm keeping an eye on, which will probably appear in a video in the next month or so, which I'm reluctant to make at the moment for reasons that will become clear. This is the Thunderbolt 4 22-in-1 docking station with hard drive and SSD RAID support. Now, this has already appeared on my radar a couple of times. It is a presentation I can see here with, quite modest pricing there, whether you want to go for the solution or not solution. It's one that's got different forms of connected media support. It's a very well presented campaign. I would say this campaign is comparable to some of the best ones out there that have succeeded. And looking at this, had I known about this project a month ago, I almost certainly would, if not backed it, I would have spent a consistent amount of time looking through the different reward tiers, looking through a lot of the people utilizing it and a lot of the background there. However, in the last month or so, despite this achieving all of its goals, despite the fact it has given a tremendously large number of engaging comments with their end user base, detailed updates throughout the project's development there, and indeed talking about a lot of the samples, the blueprints and more, it's becoming steadily apparent, and again, that's why we've not made this video yet, terms and conditions, etc., we're reading it through. It's becoming quite apparent for a lot of users that this Kickstarter is not hitting it. There was meant to be an update in March, and right now we're seeing everyone effectively saying that they want their product, they're not getting their product, they're trying to get refunds, and it's slowly but surely, and this is linked below, becoming something of a quagmire of sadness there, because it's becoming increasingly apparent that people have not received their units. Now, the reason I'm not going to go into a tremendous amount of detail now is I want to give this a little bit more time. I'm recording this video on the 21st of April, and the next shipping update was meant to be on the 18th. So again, although this does affect 1,372 backers at this stage for just shy of $500,000, it's still not quite there that we can say whether this has been a success or a failure. But I will be revisiting this Kickstarter next month because I do think it is worthy of discussion. But I wanted to include it in this video as an example of a not quite yet complete Kickstarter that seemingly ticked all the boxes in presentation, ticking the boxes in update and the content of those updates, as well as engaging with its audience. But even then, still seemingly at the last hurdle, not delivering, at least at this stage, and hopefully I'll be proved wrong. But I recommend you check that out in my description below to find out more about it, as they talk more and more about people getting quite annoyed about a Kickstarter that's seemingly looking like it's not going to be delivered. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. Maybe I'll make a follow-up to this video. If you do know of any other NAS Kickstarters, then, you know, if you do think we've missed a bunch, some of the other little mini Raspberry Pi ones that go by another name, let me know in the description. Maybe you backed some of these projects and you'd like to share your experience below. We might make an article on this, myself or Eddie, but otherwise we will revisit the subject of Storaxa, sorry, I've been talking now for the better part of 40 minutes, Storaxa, and talking more about Kickstarter NASs in the next few months as well, because there's a couple of other little projects that we're hearing about that we'll talk about more. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching and have yourselves a great week.